Good evening and welcome to this meetup about the UX strategy. I'm Tina Øvald and I'm going to be your host this evening. We are very happy to see so many people joining online again today, even though it's a bit late here in Europe. So welcome everyone, and I can see the numbers are still ticking in, so I guess we will have a lot of people participating. So as you might know, we are focusing on UX and business this fall for our content. So I'm thrilled to welcome Jaime as our speaker. Jaime is a product strategist, best-selling author, professor, and public speaker based in Los Angeles and Berlin. And for more than 30 years, she has been a pioneer in the creation of game-changing digital product and services. And you also might know her book, UX Strategy, which is now out in a second edition. And to be honest, it's one of the best UX books or UX strategy books out there. If you're interested in learning more about the UX strategy, Jaime is also hosting different UX strategy workshops, and she actually hosts one in Copenhagen in November. So you can also sign up for that one if you find this topic very interesting. And we will, of course, share a link in the material after this talk. So the agenda for today is that when I'm done with all the practicalities, Jaime will start to talk. You can ask questions in the QA section here in Zoom, and we'll go through the questions at the end of the session. We are recording everything, and we'll share the recording during the next week. And for those of you who do not know Preely yet, Preely is a self-service platform for unmoderated remote user testing. It consists of 3 areas where you can create your test and distribute it. You can host your test panel, and you can assess test data and analytics. And we collect most usability and UX metrics. And then we're also hosting different meetups like this one. And we have a new one coming in the beginning of October. And I'll tell you a bit more about that when we are wrapping up today. And then I'll give the word and screen to you, Jaime. I'm so happy that you're here. And to be honest, I'm also a bit starstruck.
But thank you, Tina. I'm totally humbled by that. So should I take it away?
Yes, please do.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jaime Levy. Thank you, Tina, for having me join your meetup. I wish it was in person, but this will do for now. And then I can't wait to come to Copenhagen for my first time in November. So hopefully I'll get to meet some people in person. Let me share my screen and we'll go from there. Okay, so what the hell is UX strategy? Let me start with the story. About 15 years ago, I was asked to do my first discovery phase. I was working at an agency in Los Angeles, a very, successful interactive agency that had a lot of entertainment clients. And I had been a senior UX designer, and I was really wanting to move into a lead role and have an opportunity to go on pitches and also, more importantly, work on this thing that I didn't know much about called the discovery phase. And so what happened was this project came in that they thought that I would be perfect for. And so I had that opportunity with several leads from other tech leads and account managers. We flew into Chicago, and the agenda was basically to do several activities with their stakeholders. And some of these activities I had never done before. So luckily there was the director of UX there, and I got to watch him and basically learn from this experience. But the agenda essentially was to sit with the stakeholders and do content audits, and then, really not even content audit, to really figure out what their concept and their, overall mission was, and then to come back to Los Angeles and create personas and feature lists and do competitive research and some other things related to it. So once we got there and we sat down with them, the big plan was to try to get all of these stakeholders on the same page. They came from different business units, so they had different agendas. And some of them, they came from business units that weren't related to the content. So for example, if you look at the diagram on the left, this was an exercise. You can see a little thumbnail of the actual whiteboard to the left of this diagram. But it was just an exercise where we were trying to have them talk about, they said the most important thing about Oprah, who, Oprah was this, she's a massive celebrity, but she had this big television show forever called Oprah. And the content was geared for women. And so, it touched all these different things from relationships to mind and body. And so these business units, whether it be her book club or the Oprah show or Harpo Films or the company, the careers who actually hired people to work for Oprah, we gave them all sticky notes and had them come up to the board and place their sticky notes as close to the top, meaning the topics that they thought they were in terms of relevancy. And then after everyone put their sticky note up there, we let them go up and move the sticky notes around. And so by this sort of consensus building exercise, we were able to have someone from the careers division realize that, she wasn't contributing to content for the show or for the website, and that potentially her unit was not the one that needed to be the focus of the website, certainly for the landing page. But it was so much better to do this type of exercise than for us to be saying to this person, oh, you don't want that, you should be, a lower priority because ... And so we did those, and it was a really great experience. And then we asked them if we could embark on doing some user research. And they said, we got you covered. We have all this marketing data. You could just take that and create some personas for us. I was like, personas? I had seen them done at other agencies, but I hadn't really worked on them myself. And the references that we had, they looked like basically, collections of their marketing data that was highly specific. And so I did as I was told, and I created these fictional personas, based on the marketing data. And we turned in the entire brief within 1 week. And then we waited and heard it was approved and that we were to start. And so then we spent 9 months basically knocking out wireframe after wireframe, and the stakeholders just went back to fighting over who should be in the global navigation and not paying attention really to what were the revenue streams, how could we build off the their business model and drive more advertising, or how could we target it to their particular customers. None of this was discussed. Instead, what they wanted to focus on was, purple versus red. And so I was really bummed by this experience, because I realized that the traditional discovery phase, which was also being called UX strategy, in this certain situation for real, was a farce. So I decided I wanted to learn everything I could about UX strategy. I wanted to know, what the hell is this thing? what does it mean? And so there weren't that many advanced UX books at the time. And so I found this one by, Rosenfeld's a great publisher, and it was by this woman named Indy Young, and it's called Mental Models. And I heard it was a book that was relevant to design strategy. So I got it and immediately started reading it, and found this sidebar in there that had this formula written by Jesse James Garrett. And basically it was a simple formula that said business strategy plus UX strategy equals experience strategy. Now the issue with that is I was trying to figure out how business plus UX equals experience. So the formula kind of left more questions than answers. So I continued doing research, and these are actually from the Wayback Machine. I went back to redo my research from that period of time. And, I learned about Indy Young, and I learned about the work that she had been doing at Adaptive Path. They were basically one of the first UX firms in the world. way back in 2006. This was before, people were doing information architecture and wireframing, so commonly, and but they were really pushing it forward. They were offering, experience, strategy, and design, and they were really defining it. And so I was really inspired by this. And as I read more about experience strategy and realized that, these terms were just kind of being used interchangeably, and that I really need not get too hung up on these terms, but focus on what was the actual practice. And so, what I saw was that I really needed to get good at field research and ethnography and learn more about, this collaborative form of ideation with clients. And then, of course, doing a competitive analysis, which we did not actually get to do on the Oprah project. And so as I moved forward, in my career and writing this book, I started, basically trying to pinpoint a definition. And so for the first edition of my book, I pretty much, said this is a process that needed to be started before the design or development of a product begins, and that it needs to be validated with real customers to prove that it's actually desired in the marketplace. That the focus needed to be on the discovery phase, on not just saying, hey, this is going to be an amazing product because we think that, but actually finding different ways to validate that this was is actually true, as far as with the customers, and also understanding it for how there's going to be revenue streams. But ultimately, this idea of UX strategies, this big picture, high level plan, that several business units, need to buy into and validate, because, making a product, is expensive and time consuming. And so you really want to de-risk it and remove, as many uncertain assumptions. But what's funny is these days, the term UX strategy is also frequently used to mean strategically executing UX at an organization. I've had a Google search alert for UX strategy and user experience strategy for about 10 years. And so I've been tracking the use of the term, and pretty much like interaction design being, interchanged with UX design, or all these other terms, they're being thrown around. And so it's hard to get an understanding, and it really confuses everyone from recruiters to hiring managers to UX designers to everybody on the team. But a lot of what I'm seeing is that when they're talking about UX strategy, they're talking about, what is our strategy for the user experience design within our organization? They're thinking about how can we be more strategic in how we implement the UX? What tools should we use? Who should we hire? How should we balance our teams? And so this is more of a strategy, I think, with the small s, because they're not really thinking about value proposition, when it's being used in this way. Like, what is our value proposition? How can we de-risk it? They're really more, this definition is more focused on, obviously, on process. So, once again, we have a term, UX strategy that's being used in different ways, and it's now being more commonly interchanged with product strategy, because with product strategy, we basically have a very similar definition, that it's like this big picture goals, and that we want to, essentially de-risk the concepts, with activities to remove uncertainty. So now let's move away from terms and just talk about, how I defined it, because I think whenever a practitioner, comes into the space, they're going to take what's out there and then try to make it there so they can practice it at their organization. So after practicing it at several different agencies, I decided, I realized that I saw, these 4 tenets sort of, basically, be part of what you needed to know in order to really, form a product strategy or form a UX strategy. And so the first one is business strategy. This is really core, because the strategy, whether product strategy, UX strategy, it's it's going to be, you know, a subset of the business strategy, and the business strategy, you know, is going to be potentially a roadmap of a bunch of products that are going to come out over time, including some revamped ones there and some other ones that are, put in their graves. And so they're balancing, you know, it's a balancing act of really trying to figure out, like, what is our organizational strategy along with, you know, what are our business goals? And so this idea of business strategy really, you know, came out, you know, of this idea of having a competitive advantage. And if you go all the way back into the 80s, you'll see, you know, one of the most popular business books was this one called Competitive Advantage by Michael E. Porter. And he defined having a competitive advantage as two possible different ways. You know, the first one would be cost leadership. It's this idea that you want to beat the competition by having the lowest prices. So essentially, you know, if we look at Walmart, we're thinking, you know, this is like a big box store that has tons of different brands, you know, in the US. And you go in there with your big cart and you see they're able to basically, you know, aggregate the brands they want and charge the lowest prices, and therefore beat off, you know, former competitors like Best Buy, or even, you know, a mom and pop store on Main Street. And so they were successfully able to take over, you know, many different verticals through this idea of cost leadership. Now, you can also have cost leadership by bringing the overall cost structure of how much it costs to make the product down. And so, you know, there's lots of ways to go at this. And so Walmart, which I find to be a pretty disgusting company in terms of, you know, how they bring these costs down. That's another story. But it's basically, you know, that's like the most common way that competitors would want to beat the competition historically. But the second way is far more interesting, and it's differentiation. And so sticking with these brick and mortar analogies, you know, if we think about Starbucks, you know, we don't think of them as having the cheapest coffee. We think of them, you know, certainly when they started, as being the first company in the US, certainly, that actually had espresso and lattes and these types of things. And so regardless that they charged, you know, the equivalent of €5 for this thing, people really wanted to experience, you know, walking into the store and smelling the roasted coffee, and, you know, having their name called once they put in their order, and really having this differentiated experience. And that was ultimately, you know, how they started winning in their marketplace. And so what it boils down to, if we think about these different ways to have a competitive advantage, it comes down to, what is your value proposition? The value proposition is pretty much, I think, the most important term. If you want to, you know, move from the design world and start talking strategies, you really need to understand this one. And the value proposition, the simple way is, you know, the promise of value to be delivered, and the belief from the customer that they're going to get this experience. And, you know, what that really means is that if you say we're the this for that, that when customers have that aha moment with your product or service, they're going to get that. Because if it isn't delivered, then they're going to be disappointed, and you've missed your probably one chance, you know, either first, you know, 5 seconds on your landing page, or, you know, first time them signing up for your product and saying, oh, this is too clunky, or this is too expensive, or whatever the problem is. And so if we even think about Apple Computer, that's, you know, a wildly successful company, when they put out the Newton, the precursor to the iPhone, you know, one of the first PDAs, you know, they promised it would have handwriting recognition, you know, that we could basically, you know, have this mobile experience where we could send email away from our computer. But it didn't live up to its value proposition, and it failed. And Apple learned from this, and, you know, numerous, you know, well over a decade later, they introduced the iPhone, which obviously, you know, lived up to its value proposition, and they, you know, continue to have, you know, huge success with this product to this day. So if we think about, you know, other value propositions, we can think about B2B products like Slack, you know, enterprise software that allows teams and businesses of all sizes to communicate effectively. That's how they would word their value propositions. You're typically talking about what does the product do and who is it for? So the value proposition is just one component of your business model. The business model has 9 different components, and it basically explains, how the company creates, delivers, and captures value. And all of these components are important to understand, but not all of them can necessarily be predicted when you're starting out with your strategy. And so that's why a lot of business plans don't really work, and they've become a little antiquated these days because they're full of 5-year projections, and we know technology changes incredibly fast, so they can be wrong. And but this is what whether it be like a startup trying to raise capital, or somebody within a business trying to take the business to the next level, they're really looking for opportunities to de-risk all of their guesses about the different components of the business plan. And that's why we see these tools such as the business model canvas by Alex Osterwalder becoming so popular, because they give us this consensus building iterative way to basically experiment with our assumptions on, like, who do we think the customer relationships should be, what are our customer segments, and to basically you go through this book, and if you aren't familiar with a business model and want something that's really simple, and it walks you through like how to tackle these different components. And what you realize after a while is that the ones on the right side are really focused on UX strategy or product strategy, and that you're basically tinkering with them as you do everything from competitive research to creating prototypes for running experiments, and saying, okay, do we really know our customer segment? Do we really know what our revenue streams are? Because the idea is you can potentially plug and play different ones, and that the business model isn't fixed. Now, there are other canvases out there. Another popular one is this one called the Lean Canvas by Ash Maurya. He's got a great book, Running Lean and then Scaling Lean. But if you look at this one compared to the other one, you'll see that about 6 or 7 of the components are identical, but this one's a bit more geared towards startups, for entrepreneurs. And it's interesting because you start with, who's our customer segment, and then say, what is their problem? What are their top 3 problems? And then move through it like that and think about the solution and so forth. So once you've identified, what you think is your value proposition, it's time to then do competitive research among other activities. But this is really important. You may think you know who the competition is, but there's going to be a whole potential nascent market out there. There's going to be indirect competitors who aren't even thinking about. And so what I saw was that so many people, when they were doing competitive research, we were just doing it like in a Word doc, running around the web, collecting screen grabs and data, and it wasn't really a methodical way for doing competitive research. And so this was something I really wanted to figure out, and I spent a lot of time researching and writing about in the book, how to really find all these different attributes, really understand why it's important, like to know when the company was founded, how much money they have to invest on, whether it be product designers or marketing, understanding their revenue streams, looking at their traffic. And there's about 19 of these that I go through. And you want to collect these on both your direct and indirect competitors. And then once you've done that, then you can use tools like the SWOT to do an analysis. I like to do them from the competitor's perspective, meaning I put on the hat of the competitors and I say, okay, from their perspective, what is their strength, weakness, and opportunity? Because if we do everything from our perspective, well, we don't have a product potentially yet. So then again, we're making guesses. And this is the thing that I really wanted to move away from, that I found, sort of to be just overlooked by both the design thinking and the lean startup methodology, because you can come out and validate your customer segment, but it's like, if you have a great idea for the product and then you get out there with your product and then realize, oh, these competitors are now, competing with me and they're better, then what's the point really? And so part of de-risking the value prop is to really understand the marketplace, and then be able to say, okay, here's what we think are the opportunities and recommendations, whether you do a findings brief like these or not. Being able to share this with your team, share this with the stakeholders, or bounce it off the stakeholders, or if you're stakeholders, engage the product team so that they have this understanding so they can connect the dots between, product design and the business strategy. Now, the next thing is value innovation. Now, value innovation's focusing on the primary utility of a product so that it becomes an indispensable part of our lives, ideally in a good way. So value innovation was a term that I learned from another popular business book, this one called Blue Ocean Strategy. Blue Ocean Strategy had basically, over about 100 different business cases on all these different companies that had basically defined uncontested marketplaces. And so what I realized with this value innovation was that they were basically taking Michael Porter's 2 different ways to have a competitive advantage and combining them. And that value innovation is this diamond in the middle. So it's this idea that you want to lower costs or bring the overall cost structure down. And you want to then create more value for the buyer, through differentiation. And I thought this approach, made complete sense. And when I started reading through all these different business cases, even going back 100 years and looking at the Ford Model T, which was the first, very common car in America, and there was a ton of them. It really changed transportation here from because before it was only wealthy people could have a custom car made for them, to this car that, even people, who were working on the assembly line could potentially afford one, by working, for not long enough. And so, what they did was basically say, okay, we're going to make this car, in one, we'll have just one design and we'll have just one color, black, and we'll just make that really, really great. And, if you think about it, it's very similar to Apple or to other companies where they're just really launching with this minimal approach, very focused approach. And if they're disrupting something, I think what Ford was disrupting was the way that you make cars, which at that time was custom and not using an assembly line. And so if you think about it, it's about process. And not just about the design. It's about how we are going to keep making this over and over so it constantly delivers value for our customers. And that could be, integrated into the product. And so if we think about value innovation for, digital products, we have to go back and think what is the value proposition? And then, what is it that they really changed? And so if we think about Waze, Waze was this Israeli startup, and their big bet was that people would be able to get from point A to point B faster by essentially using shortcuts, by basically looking at traffic patterns that are live and dynamic, and then it just giving them the routes based on that versus the traditional routes that Google Maps, and the other map algorithms were generating. And so this was based on crowdsourced data. And so this one, change, was really what gave them the competitive advantage, so much that Google freaked out and ultimately bought them so that they could then extract Waze's data and really understand, how this new technology really worked. And when we're talking about digital value innovation, it gets back to mental models. This mental models, like that book that I read by Indy Young, mental models is another term that can be used in different ways and can become really overcomplicated when it doesn't have to be. And basically our mental model when we think of something is the steps in our head, how we perceive for, accomplishing a task, getting something done, making progress in our life. So if we think about, I want to get from point A to B, hitchhiking, right? Now, in the US, hitchhiking, very scary. You don't want to get into a stranger's car, and you don't want to let a stranger get into your car, especially for women, very, very bad things can happen, but then all of a sudden a product comes out like Uber, and people are like, oh, wait, I can get into a stranger's car, and that stranger could be anybody, any gender of any age who knows how to drive and basically work for Uber or Lyft now, or these other ride-hailing companies. But they've changed, this idea, like we don't really think of them as hitchhiking because we're giving them some, we're paying them or paying the companies. But it's like we are getting into strangers' car, or if we're working for them, letting them get into our car. And so this whole mental model of hitchhiking, they don't use that term, but essentially it's really changed it and made, this activity, be okay all of a sudden. And so I think that's like the big shift with mental models, is that people need to get their head around them if they're going to be, disrupt the way that they typically do things. And that first experience of that new mental model needs to be positive. When I took my first Uber, I was scared. Someone sent me a free coupon, and I was like, okay. And then once I did it once, I saw how it worked, and then of course I became addicted to the service when I needed it. So the third tenet I talk about is validated user research. And it's this idea that we perform user research in a structured way, so with the goal of getting measurable results. And this idea, is heavily influenced by this book called The Lean Startup, a New York Times bestselling business book. If you haven't read it, now's a good time. It's not too outdated at all. Get the Audible. Eric Ries's voice is great. But it's in a lot of ways a product strategy book. What he talks about a lot is this, this diagram here, this idea of build, measure, learn. And it's this idea that, it's this idea that we start with an idea, we build a lightweight form of it. This is often called an MVP, but it could be a prototype, but it's just enough product where our target customer can experience the value prop, ideally avoiding having to do any code, no back end, concierging it, figuring out a way, or having a prototype and getting it in front of customers. And that's your product. And then measuring the feedback that you get in the form of getting data, and then learning from that, and then continuing to iterate and go through this loop over and over until you really have fine-tuned your value proposition into something that you believe is has a potential to be successful. Now, Lean Startup was influenced by quite a few books, and the big one being Steve Blank's The 4 Steps to Epiphany. And so when I started, thinking about, how can we do a validated form of user research, I looked to Alan Cooper's About Face, because he talked about something called provisional personas. And I thought, well, if we can mash that up with what Steve Blank was saying about customer discovery, because what I saw with traditional user research, ethnography, which is, typically done using field studies, it's this idea that, we go out there and we observe and we have participant interviews and we look at other research data out there to try to understand a culture or a group of people, to understand their behaviors. But typically how this is being done is that it's not done in a measurable way, so that we can say, okay, 10% or 20% of the people that we talk to think this, or their goals are this. And so the idea of making it measurable is really turning it into an experiment where you're testing a hypothesis. And so the goal is to say, okay, what is my hypothesis and how can I invalidate it or validate it, using measurable results? And so another tool in my free user experience strategy toolkit, it's at userexperiencestrategy.com, are two different, tools for designing experiments that basically they're just simple spreadsheets to walk you through, the steps of what is our value proposition, what type of experiment are we going to run, when are we going to run it, what are the hypotheses that we're testing, whether it be on the business model, the key features, the value proposition, in the form of user research, what are the questions that we really need to ask to make sure that we're going to learn, whether this product resonates with our customer segment or not, and whether they might pay for it or how we could potentially monetize them. But it really is a different way of performing user research, whether it be qualitative user research, out in the field or online, or doing, different quantitative experiments using landing pages. But the idea is that you start with a small sample set, learn from that, then increase the sample set or pivot to a different customer segment or to a different problem that you're solving. And the idea of doing this is, again, you're just trying to, basically deconstruct, what is our value proposition back to, well, who's the customer segment for, and what is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the problem statement? And get back measured learnings. And then once we do that and we have an idea, to not just jump straight into prototyping it, but to really, come up with a way to figure out, like, what is the way that we can connect the dots between, the problem that we're trying to solve and the solution that we think we should offer. And so through storyboarding, which is another great product strategy technique, it really forces the team. These can be done with pen and paper, they can be done on whiteboards, or they can be done with mock-ups. But the point is that you knock these out in under 30 minutes and focus on a really simple narrative that forces you to just focus on the key features and the value proposition, so that you're really using this as your framework before you move into prototyping, which can be quite time consuming. So with prototyping, I really believe in going for high fidelity prototypes. I've been doing prototypes forever, and it took longer to do them before, using all the older tools that were out there, or hand coding them. And now it's so easy to knock them out, whether you're using Figma or XD. And the idea is that you just really want to get these ideas in front of the customer and have them look realistic enough so they don't have to use their imagination to figure out what's going on in the screen. We're not doing usability testing. We don't care really, can they use the product? Because if they can use the product, but they don't want the product, that doesn't really matter. So the most important thing to focus on initially is, do they want this product? Do they get the value proposition? Is what we think are the key features what they think are the key features? And so I have a case study that I walk you through in the book that basically step by step goes through each of these things. If you're not familiar with any of these techniques, on how to do them, rapidly, and how to do them in a collaborative way with your teams. So the idea is that you get these prototypes, to be as realistic as possible, and that you get them in front of your target customers so that you can then ask them, questions that really get at the heart of the value proposition, the heart of, is this key feature what I think is a key feature, something that they think would be, and to not just be observing them, but to be measuring the feedback that you're getting from them so that you can ultimately, move toward validating these hypotheses. And so since, the pandemic, I really needed to, tweak my practice quite a bit, because obviously we weren't getting in front of too many customers in a physical way. And so I focused really hard on how to take the online way of doing user research and looking at the best tools out there that were either free or inexpensive, and how to, basically put them together so that you can do everything from, the recruiting yourself, but not do it in a way where you're going to have people lying to get in your study, but really know how to screen them appropriately, know how to write the advertising to bring them in, know how to generate the correct questions. And then, and then I created like another tool for actually conducting the user research. And if we want to move away from recording them and then having to go through the transcripts and then having to put everything into a format so that you can actually analyzing it, but to take that data as you're hearing it and just really take notes straight into the spreadsheet during the interviews, and keeping them really focused on validating what you think are your product strategy assumptions. So the idea in many cases is that you need to present this data at the very end, and it's really important that you do it in, I think, this distilled way to get buy-in, because what you're trying to get them to understand is that you did this in a form where you're collecting evidence to prove something, and you might be proving that their assumptions from on the team weren't correct, or that they are, and that you want to present it to them in this way where they can just sort of say, okay, so you validated the business model. What is that business model? And then, once you get this, whether it be a brief or a screen or whatever it is in front of them, then you can then show them what your process was and show them how you reach these conclusions, and say, okay, maybe, this study was very small. Let's do it again with a larger sample set. Or let's do split testing with our experiments. Another thing I like to use with whether it be enterprises or startups, or landing page experiments. This is one that I documented in the book, and it's a great case study by Volkswagen. They have an innovation studio in Berlin where they're very open to an experimental mindset. And I'm showing this in German so you don't focus on what it says, but really focus on the elements, that it's really very simple, that it's got this logo at the top, that they've got their own domain name, so it looks real. It says nothing about Volkswagen. In a lot of enterprises, you could just have a third party run the campaign to avoid any legal issues. These are basically forms of advertising and testing out product concepts. And you're using the same screens that you have from your prototype that make the product look real. And so here they were testing out an idea of, well, what if we allowed people when they bought the car to book car washes and pay for them ahead? Would this be more interesting for users in a city or users in rural areas? That was the first hypothesis they really wanted to learn, And so here we're just like seeing, a very simple landing page, basic design. The call to action here is, click on one of these two buttons to download the app, whether they even have an app in the Apple Store or not. The idea is we're just really trying to learn from this conversion. When someone sees the landing page in the first 30 seconds, are they like, oh, this sounds cool, let me try it? And so how do you get them to the landing page? Well, typically you need to run advertising. And so while I'm not a huge fan of Facebook either, they're the best game in town for doing what's called micro-targeting. You can actually take, let's say you've done your customer discovery and you have a validated persona, and you say, okay, they're this age, they're in this geographic area, they are interested in these certain things. You can actually take all of these assumptions that hopefully you validated or you need to validate, and then experiment with them using platforms like Facebook to run advertising and see how many people clicked on the ad, how many people viewed the ad, how many people clicked on the ad, how many people went over to our landing page, or maybe they went to 2 different landing pages. It's this idea of you take really one variable only and then you split test that. So you're either experimenting with the customer segment or experimenting with the landing page or experimenting with when you're running this landing page experiment, because the idea is, if we go back to the business model canvas, is we're trying to build a bridge between what we believe are our customer segment and our value proposition. That's the hardest thing. You can have the greatest product in the world, but if no one hears about it, then you have the potential to fail. And so Volkswagen ran this, what they call a smoke test. And basically, they got back, after spending two different, running it at two different audiences, with budgets, for each one between 350 and 400 euros. They were able to actually see patterns with this amount, of budget. They could say, okay, the people that are out in the rural areas are more interested in our product. So maybe we should target them. And so, this isn't definitive, but it definitely helps them understand, like, oh, potentially, we should hit the suburbs for our next campaign and test something out and see how that goes. So the next thing, the final tenet that I want to talk about is frictionless user experience design. It's this idea that we really want to take this, the concept of, the minimal value innovation and focus on that, focus on the key features and make this experience so that the customer / user can really, experience the product without having to, figure out what's going on the screen. And so what we're talking about is ultimately having the best conversion as possible, ultimately to get our customers or users or leads or whatever, wherever they are in your product funnel, through the top of the funnel and spit out at the bottom as either monetized customers or happy customers, so they keep coming back. And so there's been many, many different methodologies and processes out there. And books as well. And these are two that I recommend. The one on the left is called Hacking Growth by Sean Ellis. He coined the term growth hacking. And then this other one that's more about cognitive behavior by Niriel. And he came up with something called the hook model. And growth hacking ultimately inspired something called growth design. And growth design is this idea that you are tinkering with the levers of your product design to really say, okay, what's working? It's really not just like doing this heuristic form of usability testing, but instead saying, okay, what are the funnels within our main funnel? What are the pages? What are the screens that need to have, the highest conversion? And let's focus on those. Let's focus on the really critical use cases or user journeys, and let's measure those in a very systematic way. And so it requires that the growth designers are basically, hybrid UX designers who understand, how to deal with, analytics, whether it be, Google Analytics or actually using all these different funnel analytics tracking platforms out there. And I find them to be really exciting because at least you kind of know what's going on behind the scenes, and you're not relying on your, the guys that are, your analytics team to just say, oh, well, the traffic's coming at this time of day, or it's coming from this part of the country, but you're actually looking at what's happening on your website, at a more granular level with respect to, the most important things about your product. Now, the hook model, this is a bit controversial, and even for Nir, he has kind of moved around in different directions with this, but, away from trying to make funnels that are just, grossly addictive in a negative way, but trying to really understand, what are ways that people do get engaged with products, like what makes that happen, whether it be an external or internal trigger. They see a post on LinkedIn, they're like, oh, this is interesting. They like it, or they comment on it, and now they're engaged in the platform, and now they're invested. They get some kind of reward. People are like, oh, thanks for sharing that. And then the more and more that they become invested in your product, the more likely they are to continue using it and less likely to try out another product. And so that's the big idea with the hook model. But, what it comes down to is that, for designing for conversion, we really need to understand, how, building this funnel, really works with respect to our business model. What are we trying to do? how are we going to get people to understand or experience the aha moment? This is the top of the funnel that we're going to communicate to them, whether it be through viral growth or through, advertising, but they really need to get it from the second they land on your landing page or experience, your app for the first time, or your service. How can this be conveyed as simply as possible? How can we get them, once they hear about it, to activate it? It's quite one thing to, think of all the apps that we download, we look at it once and then we never use it again. It's this idea that we really need them to, create their accounts, turn on the notifications so that we can say, hey, you were gone, you didn't experience the aha moment then, but all of a sudden, something, is relevant to them and we let them know. And it's this idea that we really look at the entire product experience, from beginning to end, and really figure out, like, what are these points where we can really, like, hook users in and have them really understand, how this product can benefit them, how they can help them accomplish their goals and solve their problems. And ultimately, whether it be B2B or B2C, is we need to figure out, how to monetize the product, and understand, who it's targeted at, whether it be the CTO for buying software or the end user. So I want to end with an example of a favorite example for me of frictionless user experience design, which is this app that came from the startup in London, City Mapper. And I just love this thing because it's just so easy, and it makes it so that I can navigate around major cities, especially ones where I don't speak the language, and be able to take different modes of transportation. I feel continually let down by Google Maps, and getting lost when I'm in major cities, especially when it's the winter, is less than ideal. And so join me for this route where I start, at the top in one part of Berlin called Prenzlauer, trying to get to another part of Berlin in Kreuzberg. And so once I type in the location, I see how long it's going to get there using different modes of transportation. I then see the suggested routes, and I can see, okay, I can then decide at this point, do I want to take a tram plus the train? Do I want to take buses plus the train? And be able to weigh them based on dynamic information in minutes. Then once I select, it shows me the overall route. And right away, I know, I can use the phone to figure out what direction to walk into. And it shows me at these different points how long it's going to be. So I'm not scared, like, okay, am I going in the right direction? How long should I expect it to be to get to that tram? How long should it be for me before that first mode of transportation comes? And then when I get to the platform, it's actually correct. But how long it said that it was going to take is accurate to how long it's going to take on their, electric sign. And so then I feel like, okay, this is believable. And then as I put the phone away, the train comes, I'm sitting on the train. Now with Google Maps, a lot of these other mapping programs, you're just kind of like, okay, hopefully I'll get to the destination and won't miss any of the opportunities to switch. And they're trying to basically, integrate a lot of these functions from City Mapper, but they're not doing it successfully yet. What's really great here is, like, I'm in between two stations, and it's letting me know which stations I'm in between. So I have a sense of where I am at every single point during this experience. I can put the phone away, and then it sends me notifications, so if the phone's gone, then I just look at it and it says, okay, get off at the next exit. So I don't even need to have the app open, and then once I get to the next exit, it actually tells me everything from when's that next connection coming to where should I sit on the train to optimize my time so that when I get off, I'm close enough to the exit. This is extremely helpful because you're sitting there on the tram, just like passing time, waiting for the tram to come on the platform, and you could be positioning yourself. And so it's like thinking through every single step to really optimize this experience. And then it tells me, hey, it's time to get off, and it even gives you a reminder before them to remind you to collect your stuff. And then once you get off, it tells you, okay, just one step on this last thing, and here's the best exit to look for when you leave. I mean, think of how many times when you're taking a new route and you get off and you walk off the wrong exit, and you're the opposite side of the street, and that adds another 5 to 10 minutes on your journey. And so, this idea is they're really like holding our hand the entire way through, making it so that we can, walk there, know how long every step's going to take. And then, I get to my destination and I see my friend, he's looking a little bit impatient, but I got there exactly the time that I said I would, and so it's like these types of frictionless experience that, I really am inspired by, when I think about doing product design. So just to sum this up, when I think about, what are the most important things about, UX strategy, the most important thing is, that we need to, create these frictionless user experiences that are aligned with, our business model, that, this idea of like making something that's disruptive, that it should be disruptive in a positive way, not a negative way. That we do these product strategy techniques to really align our teams so that everybody's along, part of this, journey of figuring out like, how do we de-risk these value propositions, and that the stakeholders are engaged in this experience, that we like break down these walls between the stakeholders and the teams. And by doing this, we have, more people who like just feel invested in the overall product vision because they're involved in the product strategy, from the very beginning. If we think about how I opened this talk, that I really wanted to be part of the discovery phase, but I didn't know how to get invited to that party, and so, by making it so that even the members of the product team can think strategically, it benefits everybody on the team. And that by doing everything that we can to validate our product strategy, that we're ultimately de-risking, putting out a product out there that nobody wants. Because the idea of spending our time and money on our product, we only live once. So let's make the most of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you know Danish now as well. I love it.
I know DeepL to translate.
But you're ready for November then, right? So everything will be in English, in Danish at that point. We have high expectations now. So everybody, you can ask questions in the QA section. I have a question, and we actually touched a bit upon it at the end here, but do you have some tips and tricks to how to position yourself in the organization? You said that, okay, it was nice to have a seat at the table, also with the product discovery and so on. But do you have some more tangible tips and tricks? Because this is something we're asked a lot. So because we can see, being UXers, we have a lot of knowledge and a lot of, in general, we know a lot about the users. So it would be nice actually to be part of the business side of things.
Right. So what do you think are the things that are getting in the way? Like, can you give me an example of from your experience?
Yeah, from my experience, it's very much the whole saying that, for instance, benchmarking. So when we talk about competitors, then the benchmarking is very much lying in the business side of things. And then, as you pointed out in your presentation, they are looking very much into like revenue of the business, very high level stuff, where I sometimes have tried to talk about, okay, wouldn't it be nice also to benchmark the product and actually benchmark the product on the same metrics that we want to track in our own products as well. And I think I've been a bit puzzled, to be honest, that we try to speak the language of business, but right. It doesn't seem that we actually break down the wall to business when we do so. So they're just like nodding nice, but then they go about with their own agenda.
Right. And this is very common in the enterprise world, or could be in any work environment, where we have, whether it be the stakeholders or the product owner saying, okay, don't get into my territory of strategy. We own that. You guys just, play with your wireframes and your prototypes. And, and this is like the hardest part, is that, trying to just, work against them, obviously, or go rogue on this thing, we could, create enemies very quickly. And so I think a large part of it is ultimately sitting down with them, and they're acting barely interested, but turn it into more of an exploratory meeting where you're saying, hey, we're really trying to understand the product strategy. Do you think we could walk through a business model canvas? Do you think we could do like a storyboard together? Do you think we could create a provisional persona, or whatever you want to call them, ad hoc personas or proto personas? It's all the same thing, and find these really lightweight tools. So you're not just like having this conversation. And even if you're using Mira or Mural, those are great too if you're doing it over Zoom, but have this like, okay, here's our agenda. We're trying to really understand, like, can we do, how can we, who is our customer segment, and focus on really like dialing it down to not like, we want to be involved in product strategy, to we want to understand who the customer segment is for this product. Can we have a conversation about it? And then they'll say, we think it's that. Oh, cool, interesting. Up comes the mural with the persona in there. Do you think we, and let them know ahead of time, but you want to have, move these meetings away from just being, discussions and conversations to actually being collaborations. And if they're like, taking it like, oh, well, we're in charge of that, say, we get that, but we want to really understand it so that we can make a better product. I think that's one way to do it. Another tactic is to just do it and learn, really understand, if they're not going to let you do it because you want to understand the competition. Look at the competition because you really want to be able to assess, like, what is it about their product design that's amazing, or what is it about it's horrible, and we don't want to repeat mistakes. But collect this evidence, because once again, it's like going back to them, and they need to be like engaged and not be threatened by us, but say, okay, oh wow, you're really interested and you're trying to understand it just so that you can do your job better.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it also makes sense if you have something tangible you can take to the meeting to talk from, right? For instance, the business model canvas. So you have something, instead of having this like very abstract discussion, then you can actually, okay, pinpoint, okay, in this area, we actually have a lot of knowledge. Don't you want it as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a question from Emily. Do you have any experiences or recommendations to us working in quite old school organizations with very low UX maturity, especially on a management level?
Oh God. Yeah, of course we do, because in the US we were doing this stuff, and running into this wall, long ago. But that wall is still here too. It's, it's all over the world. I think it's getting less so, because I think as, that UX design, product design, it's not like this nice to have anymore, that most companies are smart enough to know that, it's absolutely essential. But so it really depends on, what is the deal with these people, why they're this lack of knowledge, and bringing in training, bringing in speakers, having like, okay, once a week, we're going to have a, fireside chat with so-and-so, and it not being, started with just like 1 hour a week of fun educational thing, and really try to figure out, like, is there resistance to it coming from a place of fear and ignorance, or is it coming from a place of, I don't think it's important. UX design is important. What I'm doing, whatever that is more important. My politics, or not having to work more than 8 hours a day. Like, I think a lot of the time it comes down to just people being lazy and not wanting on the stakeholders side, or whoever is resistant to the changes. They're afraid that it's going to make their job harder. And so if they have to learn something new, then it might mean that they could be, if they don't get it, that it could make them irrelevant. And so I think it needs to come from this place of love, of really understanding, like, what is this resistance? Is it just ignorance? And if it's ignorance, try to like say, hey, would you be interested in, coming to this meetup, or coming to, or doing these exercises with us? Or is it, they're absolutely opposed to it? Then it becomes to, can we try to understand why what's in their head? Why are they saying that? And then you need to, like, once you figure out why, then walk away, say, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then go back to your desk, or your office, and then say, okay, now let's figure out how we go back to them and say, we heard what you said. And now, I think a lot of this isn't, Tina, it's not even product design. It's just politics.
Yeah,
It's just dealing with stubborn people, whatever it is that you're trying to do, and really figure out like how to be smart about it and not create enemies, but how to build consensus and how to be seen as a bridge between these things and a positive asset if you're coming to them, and not be like this annoying person that we need to get out of here, or just like put them away on some project so they don't like open their mouth again. It's a very delicate thing.
Yeah, but I think it makes completely sense. And Emily, I think if I should say something like add on to what you said, Jamie, it is try to reach out to an organization that is quite similar to your own, and then hear what they have done as well. I know, like I did that when the place I worked before. So to have some inspiration and so on, and have some tips and tricks as well. So Grant is asking, can you elaborate more on the competitive analysis piece? How do you decide when it's feasible to compete or if it's not worth it?
Check out my book. I've got 2 chapters on it. It's about 100 pages long, and it's a 2-hour lecture. It's really not, it's something that is quite complicated. But the short answer is you need to understand how to understand who are your direct competitors are and what that means. Who are my indirect competitors? How to go out and find them on the internet and get access to their platform, product, or service that you may not have access to. And if you don't have access, how to find information about it. So it's about gathering competitive intelligence. It's about, once you populate, in the case, how I do it is a spreadsheet full of data, to take that data and say, how do you analyze it? And so I teach step by step, like, okay, I'm going to go through the competitors and I'm going to say, what are the most important attributes to benchmark in this case? Is it like they're winning by their revenue stream? Are they winning from monthly traffic? Are they winning from their design? And really start triangulating the data points that are important so you can do competitive benchmarking. And then once you have these, like I have them done as mini SWOTs, that's what you saw in that slide there, to take all these like SWOTs of each individual competitor, and then to do this high level analysis of the competitors, but garbage in, garbage out. And so it's really about being methodical from the very beginning, and being like unbiased, and really having the right competition, and it being thorough, collecting the right data. And then if you have the right data, doing, a really good competitive analysis. And then ultimately, if you need to take it to the next level, figuring out how to present it using storytelling, so that people will buy into your idea, without getting, completely like, oh my God, our deadline is going to be pushed, or it's going to cost more money. Everything, I feel like with the strategy these days, and I hear this over and over, it's less about the product strategy and more about the strategy in dealing with the teams and the stakeholders to get everybody on the same page. And why is it still happening in 2021? My goodness, we have so many different collaborative tools now. I would think like at this point, people are attuned to doing this stuff, but I think there's still a lot of people coming into the industry that so I think it's going to go away, that don't have this backing in product design, and they really need to be, and if they're the stakeholders and they haven't been part of this, they're going to be resistant. And it's really about understanding how to be very smart in in building consensus through, evangelizing it in this way that you're not talking down to them in any way.
What we have been discussing is also the whole approach with having, like, especially business being like, okay, we know better than everybody else. It's also something with the whole idea of having a set of competencies, right? And then if you can't be like, okay, this is right, this is wrong, but you actually need to ask questions, then a lot of people actually feel threatened, because I should be able to answer this, because I should be able to, take care of this role I have. And I think that's a weird mindset to have, but we see it a lot here in Denmark as well.
Yeah, very true.
Yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame.
To see it as like another challenge that's part of what we have to do as product designers, which is be, evangelizing something that we believe in, but we need to not it be like, I'm right, I'm smarter than you, I've been doing this for more years, like, like that never wins. I tried that, I promise you from my own experience, being the know-it-all or being, I'm the pioneer, blah, blah, blah. Like, they don't care. They just want you to make the thing and shut up. So it really is, it's like, take them out to lunch and become friends with them. Start with that, just like, that's why we need this pandemic to be over, is we need to build these relationships up again and build trust, because they're not going to listen to what we have to say if they don't trust us and they just think we're trying to take their job or a part of their job away. Yeah. We really need to be mindful of this, and it's really comes down to emotional intelligence in a lot of ways.
Definitely. So Andreas is asking, what are the biggest mistakes you have seen UX designers make when venturing into UX strategy work for the first time?
I think mistakes. I think I need more details on, like, what's the environment. If they're talking about their process, their mistakes is that they're not doing something right. It's just like, I think about doing strategy the same way I think about design, right? So when people are making mistakes in their design, it's because they don't have enough experience, or worse, they aren't familiar with the tools and not using it right and not researching how to use it right, or a combination of both. And so with strategy, I think it's great. I mean, a lot of my readers unexpectedly were newbies. I mean, I wrote the book for mid to, senior level people. That was who I thought my audience was. But it turns out that the people that are coming into the field that are getting their certificates, from these different design schools in 6 weeks to 2 years, they're like, oh, I do XD. I'm an awesome product designer. But they don't really have the foundation. And so one mistake is they're doing strategy before they really understand how to do good product design. And so they should chill out a little bit. They're super ambitious, but that's great. But get good at what you're doing first, whatever your job title is, before you start venturing into something else. And then I'm not saying don't learn about it, be aware of it, but get your 10,000 hours, the Malcolm Gladwell tipping point, and that's 40 hours a week. For a lot of weeks, 4 to 5 years is really, really good at something, and so a lot of people are getting ahead of themselves. And so when you're particularly young or naive, you think, oh, I can just do everything. And it's good to have an open mind and to be confident, but at the same time, you might be putting other people off. And so I'd say learn first by doing these strategy techniques and keeping that information, that evidence to inform your design. Don't go running around, until you're absolutely sure, like, now's the right time to let them know that I spent my last week doing competitive research or doing customer interviews without permission, but go slowly. And, as you're getting better at design, then get better at strategy too, and think of it as, that you need to get into the pool and get used to the water and swim around, and that, you don't want to drown, but you want to just kind of learn this thing. And the more that you practice, the better that you're going to get.
Yeah, I think it makes completely sense. And then I also think you have a great point with starting actually to put numbers onto the research you do as well, because it seems to be a great thing that can open different doors as well. So yeah. So we have another question. Can you give an example of how you use provisional persona for a project or a value innovation?
Well, the provisional personas we use for basically as the starting point for doing customer discovery. And so it's this idea that you don't have this fictional persona that's just made up. Well, you're going to start with these assumptions, but you don't have like a zillion different data points, but you actually say, what is the perceived value proposition by the stakeholders of the product? So let's say it's, let's just pretend it was Waze, right? Let's say Waze wasn't out there, for crowdsourced data. And so now we're like, okay, let's backwards engineer this. Why do we have this cool prototype? This concept of Waze. We think it's for what customer segment? Is it for people who commute to work, or is it for people who are in a rush to go to a one-time event, or is it for both? And putting all of these assumptions, about this segment and focusing on one at a time, but like a lot of the personas that I see, they're just like, she has a dog, and it's not like a product to sell dog food or anything related to pets. She likes movies, and it's not related to entertainment. They're like putting all of these things in there that aren't really relevant, but it's like understanding like, what is the problem that this, if it's Waze, okay, the customer segments, this group of people, that's our guest. Let's make one persona for that. Let's make statements about their goals. Let's make statements about what are their behaviors. Let's make statements about their needs. And then let's use customer interviews and interview 5 people that we think match it. And then say, okay, what are the questions? This is the hardest part, is saying, what are the questions that we need to ask them in order to validate all of these assumptions on the persona? And so the persona moves from being this like, oh, we did personas, to being, like, here's this exercise that we think represents our customer segment, to just being this starting point tool that we maybe started it, that we do in a brainstorming session with the stakeholders or with our team, to being this like, okay, here's our guide map. We're going to generate the questions based on this persona. And now let's go ahead and go and talk to the customers. And so to answer your question directly, I've done it for many different startups. Like I did it for a political organization that was trying to convert people to participating more in political polls, because people hate that stuff. And so we had to find people who were interested in politics. And so we had to wait for some kind of, relevant event in Los Angeles to go to find these people, and essentially stalk them and go up to them and say, hey, and offer them a gift card. Hey, do you have 5 minutes of your time? I'll give you a free coffee card at blah, blah, blah. And then if they said yes, and then asking them screener questions, and then, sitting down with them or just talking to them and having customer interviews. And this is before you have a prototype. I think that's the important thing, is that the personas are just like this thing, this checklist really of points that you want to validate.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Carol is asking, have you ever experienced a situation where all user/market research was telling you that the product idea was great, but when it actually got released, things didn't turn out so well?
Yeah, all the time. Which is why you don't just stop at competitive research. You take you get your findings brief, and it's like, oh, I think this idea is amazing. I think this is going to be our revenue model. I think 1, 2, 3, and then build a prototype, or build some, MVP or whatever you want to call it, and get it in front of customers. Don't go from competitive research to build. That was something I stopped doing, over 10 years ago. I'm always saying, oh, let's build a prototype. And they're like, oh, but we think it's this idea. I'm like, great, let's build 2 prototypes and we'll test both, but it's this idea like, I'm not right. I'm right, you're wrong, but hey, maybe we're both right. And this opportunity, because you might have this really great idea from the competitive research, but it's still an assumption. It's still a value proposition that you have to test. And so that's why you really need to, get something in front of customers and not get too far ahead on your roadmap. And I like the idea of having two, because then you can like split test different features and just avoid spending huge amounts of money. And the great thing about it is it also lets you experiment with the design, and it gives freedom. You can turn it into this like mock competition where you're like, okay, I'm going to have everybody work on one of their own designs of the features on whatever they think it is. And then that way people can just kind of like brainstorm their own ideas separately. And then you come together and you take all the ideas and you're like, okay, how about this? How about this? How can we integrate them together? You make it really, as collaborative and more of like this. I think we just need to turn like what we're doing into this idea, like everything, not to overuse the term, but everything is just this experiment that we're trying to, prove it to be right or wrong. And just be open to, it might fail, and it probably will fail. Most products fail. It doesn't matter how great your research is. And so that's why we're doing product strategy, to de-risk it and to take this uncertainty of spending $1 zillion, so it's less uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great answer. I think this is going to be the last question from Alexis, and it's a bit long. Do you have any thoughts on how practitioners dedicated to UX research can best contribute to those approaches to strategy? So that's the first question. And then the second one is, I can see ways your insights translate from designers to researchers, but I'm curious if you have specific wisdom to share with us researchers. Sorry.
I think, I think when I'm talking about these things, it's for both the UX researcher and the designer. The researchers, I think those lucky enough to actually have that title and just focus on research, they need to think about how are they delivering the evidence? How are they delivering? They do a research study on a prototype, or they do a research study without a prototype on a customer segment. At the very end of the day, are we having just a slide presentation? How can we, make sure that once we present this idea, that we then turn it into really a discussion about what people think, and that we like highlight, I've done this as a researcher where I turn in this like study and it's got 15 different insights. But by the time they get to the 6th or 7th one, they're like, they've stopped reading, they've tuned out, especially if they read one they don't agree with. They're like, eh. So I think you got to pick your battles and say, what are the 2 or 3 most important things I need to emphasize here, and really try to run it, what I've been talking about. And I didn't invent this, it's what, Eric Ries and Steve Blank, have been saying for forever, which is that we need to run our research, in the form of an experiment for validating hypotheses. And then when we do it, then the evidence is tangible. I think that's the thing, is that people, how when someone gives you advice about something and you're like, okay, so I need to be, this I need to do this at a high level, or I need to do that. We can walk away from that meeting very frustrated because we don't have something that's tangible. A lot of us what's my call to action? So you're telling me that this isn't great. So then what is great? But to really take the research to the next level and say, okay, now I'm going to try to be more predictive, and then say, okay, here is what I think, and here is why I think it, based on the evidence that I've gathered.
Mm-hmm. I think that was a good answer. So I think time is almost up, but thank you for a very interesting talk, Jaime. And I'm looking very much forward to read the 2nd edition of your book, and maybe also join your workshop in Copenhagen in November, because I definitely think there's a lot to gain from this. And also the whole idea of starting to put numbers onto the experiences in order to actually talk into the business strategy as well. That's definitely something that resonates very well with what we do here at Preely as well. So
that's so great.
You're preaching to the choir here, to be honest. So we love that.
Well, thank you everybody for these tough questions. I wish I had more time, but please, if you're interested, this might be my one time in Copenhagen. Please come to the workshop. I've got early bird tickets there for 400 euros. If you've got a team of people you want to send, I got giveaway one for if you buy 3. And I will educate your UX designers or researchers on how to do this with hands-on techniques. And it'll take all day, but it'll be intense and fun. And thank you everybody for coming and these questions. I can't wait to visit Copenhagen. And thank you, Tina and Prelay, so much.
You are welcome. And I actually have Alexis saying that you should come to Atlanta as well. So maybe you have like an open invitation there. I don't know.
Atlanta, Georgia? Okay.
It's just as Atlanta. Alexis, reach out to Jamie. I think you might have something going on there with the workshop as well. So I'll just end up now. So I actually made a cliffhanger in the beginning of the meetup with our next speaker. So we are thrilled to announce that our next meetup, or the speaker at our next meetup, is going to be Jeff Gotthelf. So he's one of the fathers of Lean UX, and also he's actually talking very much into this Lean UX canvas. So it might go very much hand in hand with the things you presented today, Jamie.
Definitely.
So definitely put big X in the calendar on October 7th at 9 a.m. CETS. So that's going to be in the morning instead of evening, where Jeff will join us. And again, if you have any ideas or suggestions on how we can improve our online meetups, let us know. And also if you have some ideas on some topics you want to hear, or some speakers you would like to hear as well, let us know, and then we'll see what we can do. And keep an eye on your inbox for both the recording of this session and also a link to Jamie's UX strategy workshop in Copenhagen, and also a sign up link for the next event. So I think that was all from me. Thank you so much for joining us, Jamie. And I'll just say to everybody, thank you for joining as well, and have a great evening, everyone. Adios.
Bye-bye.